2014, and this is the Saturday, the class on the Majjhima Nikaya. Okay, so we can start now with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So recording, is it on? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so we have been studying the sutta called the Chabbisodhana Sutta, the Sixfold Purity or the Sixfold Cleansing, and this is Sutta number 112 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And last week we went through the first few sections of this sutta. Just to recapitulate, the theme of the sutta is how a monk should be investigated or interrogated when he declares what is called anya, which is the word that is translated here as final knowledge. And so the standard way in which the declaration of final knowledge has come down in the suttas is with the declaration that the monk says, I understand that birth is destroyed, or that sounds a little weird, I have to say that, maybe we could say that birth is finished. In other words, that the cycle of rebirths is finished, that the brahmacharya, the spiritual life, the holy life, has been fully lived. What had to be done has been done. That is the four tasks regarding the Four Noble Truths, fully understanding the truth of dukkha, abandoning the craving, which is the origin of dukkha, realization of nibbana, the cessation of dukkha, and fully cultivating the path, the way to the end of dukkha. And when one does this, then one can say further that there is no more coming back to any state of being. And so when a monk declares this, the Buddha says that his statement should neither be accepted nor rejected, but instead you should question him. And the Buddha is going to describe various ways to question the monk. The first way that's given in this sutta is by way of what are called the four kinds of expression. That is, one speaks of the seen as it was seen, of the heard as it was heard, in regard to the sensed and the cognized. So the monk should be one who is able to say that he abides basically without any attachment and without any repulsion and without any delusion about things seen, heard, sensed, and cognized. Okay, so that is the first section. then even if a monk explains in that way, the Buddha says one could go on with the investigation by asking a further question. And so one tells him that there are these 5 aggregates subject to clinging. Then how do you know, how do you see regarding these 5 aggregates subject to clinging? And if the monk is one who is truly liberated, then he'll speak about how he has seen each of the 5 aggregates to be feeble, without any substance or essence, fading away and comfortless. And then having seen it in that way, he has reached the destruction, fading away, cessation, giving up and relinquishing of attraction and clinging, of mental standpoints, adherence, and underlying tendencies regarding the 5 aggregates. Okay, then the third section, the monk should question the one declaring final knowledge in terms of the 6 elements. So, the 6 elements are the 4 material elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Then the space element, and then finally the consciousness element, which I said should be seen in order to get all the aspects of experience included in the 6 elements. We should also see the consciousness element as implying the presence of the other mental aggregates: feeling, perception, and volitional activities. And so when the monk is one who has been completely liberated, then he'll declare with regard to each of these elements, again, that he has treated the earth element as not self, with no self based on the earth element. And then with the destruction, fading away, cessation, giving up, relinquishment of attraction and clinging based on the earth element and so forth, he has understood that his mind is liberated. And the same thing is said with regard to each of the other elements. And now when this declaration is made with regard to each of the elements, if we just take the basic statement in relation to the space element, okay, he says that I have treated, or we could say I have seen, I have approached, perceived the earth element as not self, with no self based on the earth element. We could say that these 2 statements are briefly stating all 4 kinds of personality view, identity view, or view of an existing self. If you remember from some of the earlier suttas that we've come across, when the Buddha is fully explaining the nature of identity view, for example, in Sutta number 44, where the speaker actually is not the Buddha, but the nun Dhammadina. This is on page 397. This sutta takes the form of a conversation between a male lay devotee named Visakha and the bhikkhuni or Buddhist nun Dhammadina. And the lay devotee is asking Dhammadina a number of quite subtle questions about difficult or knotty points of the Dhamma. And here on page 397 in section 7, he asks her, how does identity view or view of self come to be? And then Dhammadina explains that the uninstructed, ordinary person who doesn't have any insight into the Dhamma regards material form as self or self as possessed of material form, or material form as in the self, or the self as in material form. And so here we have, and then the same thing is said regarding each of the other 5 aggregates. So here we have regarding each of the 5 aggregates, or any particular aggregate, we have 4 ways in which the idea of self is formulated. Either we have direct identification of that aggregate with the self, so if we take, just taking form as the example, or we have possession, in which the self is seen to possess, to be the owner. You could say self owns form. The third one is form as in the self. So this is a kind of view that one would have found perhaps being promulgated by some of the thinkers and philosophers of the Upanishads, who had the idea that there's a vast, universal, all-encompassing self, which is permanent, changeless, indescribable, and everything that belongs to the person exists within this all-embracing self. And then the fourth position is that the self exists in form. So when one takes this position, then one conceives of the self as being something, it could be like an inner soul, an inner witness, and even in some of the Upanishads, they speak about the self as being infinitesimally small, but located at the center of the heart. So in this case we have the self in form, and also some of the Upanishads speak about 5 coverings which enfold the self. If I remember, there's the gross covering, which is the covering made, is called the food, the covering made of food. This would be the gross material body. Then there is the pranamaya kosha. This is the covering which is made of, literally, of breath or of vitality. So this is the vital component of the material body, which is a subtler layer than the gross material body. Then we have the covering manomaya kosha, the covering or sheath made of mind. This would be, I guess, the collection of mental functions. And then subtler still, there is, I think it's called the vijnana maya kosha, the covering of consciousness, which is distinguished here from mind. This, I guess, would be the light of awareness. And then the subtlest sheath is the anandamaya kosha, called the sheath consisting of bliss. That would be like the subtlest layer of the psychic being. But then even subtler than these 5 layers or 5 coverings, there is the innermost core, which is the supreme self. And so the task of the contemplative, of the meditator, is to go through in meditation each of the 5 sheets and see that the 5 sheets are not the self. In a way, that sounds a little similar to Buddhism, except that in the Upanishads, when one breaks the identification with the 5 sheets, then one eventually discovers at the core of the 5 sheets their innermost essence, which is the Atman, the self, which at the same time is the Brahman, the universal divine reality, which underlies the whole universe and which is the power behind all cosmic processes. I sometimes wonder whether the Buddha used the formulation of the 5 aggregates as a kind of counterpoint to the Upanishadic theory of the 5 sheets. So there's no direct evidence that he appropriated this idea from the Upanishads. But it seems a bit curious that they both use a scheme of 5 elements of the person. Except that for the Buddha, the view, whereas for the Upanishads, the view of the self in form or within the 5 sheets is the height of wisdom. For the Buddha, this is a kind of what's called an identity view or self-view, which is adopted by the uninstructed, ordinary person, the person of the world. Okay, so in regard to the 5 aggregates, the standard formulation, we have these 4 types of view of self. Okay, in one, we could see that there is a direct identification. So this is form is self. And what is common to the other 3 views? Apart from the fact that they are formulated in terms of the self, what is their common feature that distinguishes them from the first view?
They're not equal.
Right, that there's some distinction between the self and the aggregate. So the self stands in some relation to the aggregate, but it's not identical to the aggregate. And yet when one formulates or expresses that view of self, one expresses it in terms of the aggregate. Either the self either owns the aggregate, it possesses form, or the aggregate form is in the self, or the self exists within form or the other aggregate. And so when we see that these 4 types of identity view can be actually reduced to 2, if you want to simplify, you have either the form is the self, or you could say self exists that the self exists in some relation to form. And so when we look at this particular way of handling the view of self, and then we come back to the sutta on the Sixfold Purity, then we could see what is really being the intent of the statement in paragraph 8, page 905, that I have treated I don't really like that translation so much. The verb here is upagacchati. Which means to approach, to go to. But I guess it takes on the meaning of, sort of implied meaning, I have considered, looked upon. And so here he says, I have treated, that is, I have looked upon the earth element as not self. So you can see that this is just an alternative way of stating that, or it's the rejection of the view that form is self. So it's negation of this view, is rejecting it. And then when he says, I have treated no self based on the earth element. Okay, so when he says, I have treated no self based on the earth element, in effect what he's doing is negating the other three possibilities. So he's negating the possibility that the earth element is either the basis for a self that owns it, or the earth element is inside the self, or the earth element is a receptacle, and the self is inside the earth element. And then he makes the same statement with regard to the other elements, the water element, the fire element, the air element, and then the space element and the consciousness element. Okay, if there's any questions now on what I've just covered, please feel welcome to ask. Please.
The self is only for discussion on that is only on this present life, right? Doesn't discuss life after, or does it?
Well, I think the idea would be that if there is a self considered either... Actually, let's put it this way. If one identifies the self with the material elements, if one says that earth, the five material elements here, the earth, water, air, fire, and space elements are the self, that would lean to the view, it's called annihilationism, because when the body dies, then the material elements break up, and so then one would hold that the self perishes and dies at death, and that there's no continuation beyond this life. But if one holds the other view, that the self is something distinct from the material elements, or if one holds the view that the self is consciousness, that the consciousness element is the self, then one could hold that this, even though the body breaks up and perishes, but the self remains the same, and it moves on, transmigrates to a future life. And so that will, holding that the self is based on the material elements, or that consciousness element is the self, this will lean towards the view of what's called eternalism, the view that there is a permanent, eternal, unchanging self. Any other questions? Okay, so let's go on now to the next section. So this is section number 9. Okay, so the Buddha says that if a monk answers in this way, then the monks should applaud his words, but they should still, at least they could still, investigate him further. And they do this by posing the question in terms of the 6 internal and external sense bases. And there's a little bit problem in this section. Okay, so let's first read it. Okay, so the question is put to him, "Friend, there are these 6 internal and external bases rightly proclaimed by the Blessed One who knows and sees, the accomplished one, the fully enlightened one. What 6? They are the eye and forms, the ear and sounds, the nose and odors, the tongue and flavors, the body and tangibles, the mind and mind objects. These, friend, are the 6 internal and external bases rightly proclaimed by the Blessed One. How do you know, how do you see regarding these 6 internal and external sense bases?" Okay, this much is quite standard. There's nothing unusual or problematic here. So we know that we call these the 6 ayatanas, which means the 6 bases for consciousness. And the 6 bases are divided into 2 subtypes, subcategories. The internal, which are sense faculties, including the mental faculty, and then the external, which are their objects. And so we have the eye, the faculty of sight, and visible forms. The ear and sounds, the nose and odors, the tongue and taste, and the body and tactile sensations or tactile objects. So those are the 5 physical sense faculties and their respective objects. And then we have the mind faculty called the manayatana, or the mind base, which has its own distinct class of objects, which are called by the rather general term dhammas, which here we could render as mental objects or mental phenomena. And so the mind faculty, or the mind base, can take also the objects of the physical senses, because we also, conceive and classify and describe with our minds the objects of sight, sound, odors, tastes, and so on. We can recognize them, we can compare them, we can distinguish them, we can conceptualize them. All of that is the work of the mind base. But the mind base also has its own class of objects, purely mental objects, abstract concepts, ideas, mental images, judgments, discernments, and so forth. And these are called ayatanas, bases, because when consciousness arises, it always arises based upon a sense faculty, and it always takes some object. So consciousness, there's a word that's been used in philosophy to describe this aspect of consciousness, that it's always intentional. In that it always intends an object. That is, there's no such thing as a purely, what you might call a pure consciousness, at least according to the Buddhist teaching, that there's no such thing as a consciousness which is not based upon some sense base inwardly, and which does not take some object. Even the most refined meditative states, like the jhanas and the formless meditations, have their own distinctive objects, though the objects are very, very subtle. But for example, in the base of infinite space, then the object is the infinity of space. In the base of infinite consciousness, then the object is the infinite expanse of consciousness. Okay, so these are the 6 internal and external bases. And then the monks are to ask the one declaring arhatship, how does the Venerable One know, how does he see, regarding these 6 internal and external bases, so that his mind is liberated from the asavas through non-clinging. And then if a monk is one whose asavas are truly destroyed, or if he's one who has a copy of the Sutta folded up, written down on the palm of his hand, so he could glance down when he's being examined, then this is the way he'll answer. He'll say, friends, with the destruction, fading away, cessation, giving up and relinquishing of desire, lust, delight, craving, attraction, clinging, and mental standpoints, adherences, and underlying tendencies, regarding the I forms, I consciousness, and things cognizable by the mind through I consciousness, I have understood that my mind is liberated. And here there's a little problem. Anybody identify what the problem is? Okay, just go through, the problem isn't with anything with destruction, fading away, cessation, and so on, but it's the object of that. We have the I forms, I consciousness, and things cognizable, let's leave out the phrase by the mind, things cognizable through I consciousness. I have understood that my mind is liberated.
Perhaps there's still the expression of an I or my mind.
No. No, the problem isn't with the expression my mind. Suki, stand up and speak boldly.
Things cognizable by eye consciousness, isn't it same as form?
Yeah, that seems to be the problem here. That usually in many of the sutta passages which are describing sense perception, they speak about, through the eye, let me see how it's put. Maybe this comes in the Samyutta Nikaya more often, but they speak about forms cognizable by the eye. And so it seems that the things cognizable by the eye would be forms, and the things cognizable by the ear would be sounds, things cognizable by the nose would be odors. So why this differentiation of forms and things cognizable by the eye, things cognizable by the ear? It seems like a redundancy. The commentary, I have a note on this in the back. The commentary goes to some lengths to try to explain how to interpret this, but I have to say the explanations are not very convincing. But I did look at the Chinese counterpart to the sutta, which is Majjhima Agama number 187, and in its counterpart to this section, it just has eye consciousness, and things to be known by eye consciousness. So it doesn't have that redundancy. So it seems to me that the text should have read, regarding the eye, maybe we have put it in a different order, the eye consciousness, and forms cognizable through eye consciousness. And then maybe for the next section, the ear consciousness, and sounds cognizable by ear consciousness. That would make sense. Or another way to take it, if one wants to accept all four as valid, would be, for example, if I'm looking at, say, this little table here, the form would just be the appearance, the color and shape, but the thing cognized by eye consciousness would be the table in its totality. But we don't find other texts which makes this distinction. So it seems to me that there's been some error in the way the text has been formulated and handed down, and that we should just see three things here. Okay, so anyway, we have here now basically the statement is showing that the monk who's declaring arahatship is free from all craving, which is summed up which is expressed in terms of a number of similes. Desire is chanda, lust would be raga, delight nandi, craving is tanha, attraction, I don't remember the word used for attraction here, could be anurodha, and clinging would be upadana, and then of mental standpoints, adherences and underlying tendencies, those could take into account both craving and wrong views, or even taking greed, aversion and delusion. But in any case, he's saying that his mind is freed from all defilements regarding the objects of perception, regarding the sense faculties, and regarding the consciousness. Okay, any question on this section? Okay, then we go on to the next section. This is section number 11. Okay, so now, again, if the monk answers in this way, his brother monks should appreciate his statement, but again, they can question him further. And now comes the question, how does the Venerable One know? How do you see? So that in regard to this body, with its consciousness and all external signs, that sounds, I have to say, sounds a little strange. I've changed my translation of this to objects, because external signs would be like coming up Zhuangyan Monastery, you'll see sign parking lot, sign this way to the Great Buddha Hall, this way to Guanyin Hall, this way to the dining hall, or driving out on the street, speed limit 50 miles per hour. It doesn't mean signs in that sense, but the word here is nimitta, which can be translated objects. So it's referring to this body with its consciousness. So here we have all the material components of existence sort of summed up in the body, and then all of the subjective or mental aspects of experience summed up simply with the word consciousness. And then all of the objects of experience comprised by the expression external signs, I think it's bahida nimittani. Okay, so in regard to all of this, I-making, mind-making, and the underlying tendency to conceit have been eradicated. These are the three important terms. Yeah, one thing I should say about this compound, you see, Pali is, they call it an agglutinative language, in that you could, I used this expression yesterday, that you could glue words together to form long compounds. And so this is a long compound, ahankara, mamankara, mananusaya. And it's a little bit, because it's formed a compound, it's a little bit unclear whether the last word, anusaya, underlying tendency, should be taken only in relation to conceit, or whether it should be taken in relation to all three of them. I'm inclined actually to take it in relation to all three of them, so that we have underlying tendencies to I-making, mind-making, and conceit. And these three terms are connected with the activities of three particular types of mental defilements. I-making is generally sort of connected or explained to result in a view of a substantial self, some kind of metaphysical self, or some kind of persisting ego entity behind the process of experience. Though also, since conceit revolves around the concept of I, we could also say I-making also leads into conceit. So the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So I would also put I-making as a basis for view of self and conceit. But maybe because conceit also plays a very prominent part in our mental life, so the Buddha has made it here a separate factor amongst these three. Okay, and then the second one is called mamankara, which means making mine, making things mine. And this is connected with the activity of craving. Because craving is, you could say, it's a drive not only to enjoy, to find delight in the objects of the senses, but it also has a possessive tendency. It's sort of the basis upon which we grasp things and appropriate them, take them to be possessions of myself. And so you could say that through I-making we create the sense of an inner self, and then through mind-making we reach outwardly and grasp hold of things and take them to be mine, not yours. You know, like we have all of these labels. This is the property of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Anybody who takes this will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And then what's interesting is that these expressions, ahankara, mamankara, imply or suggest that the I and mine are things which are made or fabricated. You know, that they're not realities existing in their own right, but they are the products of mental construction, the constructive activity of the mind. So we construct the idea, even at very subtle levels, we construct the idea of an inner I, an inner self, and then we construct the idea of something belonging to me, being mine. You know, like this recorder, in itself, it doesn't have any intrinsic belongingness to Bhikkhu Bodhi. It just is a collection of different electronic parts put together, sitting on the table with the function of recording. But because of my mental activity, well, of course somebody gave it to me, but then I project the idea that it's mine. In fact, I had a very interesting experience with this, I think it was this very recorder. This was 2009. This was interesting. I was invited to go to Copenhagen when they were having the conference. This was the climate conference in Copenhagen. This was the UN every year they have this climate conference which always fizzles out and nothing is accomplished. But that year they had like a spiritual organization that's based in New York, invited spiritual people, religious people from different faiths and backgrounds to come to Copenhagen to have a kind of, alongside the UN conference, to have a spiritual conference on changing or reducing climate change or stopping climate change. And so I was there and I had my tape recorder, this recorder, and I was on one of the panel discussions, and then right after the panel discussion was lunchtime, but somebody pulled me aside when I came out from the panel and was speaking to me. Then I went back to the place where I put my recorder, and the recorder was there, and so I took it, and because I brought it because I wanted to record my presentation. And then, we went through the rest of the conference. Then I came back to New York, and I played it, and it was not mine. It was everything was in French. And I was wondering, how did this happen? This is my recorder, but it's speaking French, and my talk isn't on there, and all the other things that I recorded, previously, not there, but just a whole bunch of recordings in French. So fortunately, I contacted the organizer of the conference, and fortunately they found that there was somebody from France who also participated in our conference group, and they had her contact information, and I contacted her, and she said that she had picked up a recorder and it didn't have her talks, but somebody giving lectures in English. And so we sent our recorders from one to the other, and I got my recorder back. So you see, all the time I was thinking, this is my recorder. Why is it speaking in French? But in fact, awakening came, not mine. Now if I could get that idea, not mine, in regard to everything, including this body with its consciousness and all external signs, then I'm liberated. Okay, so now the monks ask, how is it that in regard to this body and consciousness and all external signs, you have eradicated I-making, mind-making? Oh, I didn't explain conceit yet. Okay, conceit is the third factor involved here. And I wrote on the board, conceit revolves around what I call the inflated sense of I. But this sense of I moves in a different direction from the formulation of a view. The sense of conceit arises when one takes the idea of I and uses it to build up one's sense of, we say, self-worth, prestige, sense of, sometimes it's said that this conceit can work in three ways, because one is measuring, through conceit, one is measuring oneself against others, and so one can conceive oneself as being either superior to others. That's the connotation of the word conceit, the usual connotation in English, that one is superior to others. But in the Buddha's explanation, there are three aspects. Apart from the superiority conceit, there is the conceit of being just as good as others. Just like my mother used to tell me when I was a kid, because I was quite short when I was a kid, and all of the big kids sometimes would make fun of me, so my mother would say, "Don't worry, you're just as good as they are." So then you feel happy because you know that you're as good as others. And then comes the third kind of conceit. This is what we call the O-mana in Pali, with an O in front of it, which is, that prefix O indicates going down. So this is the inferiority conceit. Sometimes it's also explained as hino asmi mana, the conceit that I am inferior to others. So there's the seyo hamasmi, that's I am superior to others. Sadiso hamasmi, I am equal to others. And hino asmi mana, I am inferior to others. Because even when you think, oh, I'm not as good as anybody else, that's not real humility, but that's a subtle kind of clinging to the notion of I. Real humility is you don't have any sense, well, it doesn't have to be the selflessness of an arhat, but real humility means that one just doesn't compare oneself with others, but one accepts one's own portion of talents, abilities, skills, beauty, strength, and so forth, just as they are. Maybe trying to improve, of course, but not using this as a basis for ranking oneself, putting oneself in the ranking order in relation to others. Okay, so now the monks ask the monk who's claiming final knowledge how he has eradicated I-making, mind-making, and the underlying tendency to conceit. And this question comes up, this is an interesting point, in a number of other suttas, particularly in the Samyutta Nikaya. One sees there might be about 8 or 9 or even 10 suttas in which this question is raised, particularly in the chapter 22, the connected sayings, connected discourses on the 5 aggregates. And invariably, or at least most often, the answer is whatever material form there is, internal or external, or whatever material form there is, past, present, or future, internal or external, high or low, inferior or superior, far or near, one sees all material form as it really is. This is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. And then the same is repeated for the other 4 aggregates. So that is the answer that one finds repeatedly in the Samyutta Nikaya. For example, chapter 22, there are several suttas in the 60s, might be 63, 64, which give that answer, or it could be 69, 70, I'm not sure exactly. But if you look around in the 60s in chapter 22 of the Samyutta Nikaya, you'll find that answer. But here we have a different presentation. Maybe this presentation is used because this particular sequence is quite typical or quite standard in the Majjhima Nikāya. So the monk here is going to explain in terms of the full, what is called the sequential training. So he starts off by saying that in the past, when I lived the home life, I was ignorant. Then the Tathagata, the Buddha, or his disciple taught me the Dharma. On hearing the Dhamma, I gained faith in the Tathagata. Possessing that faith, I reflected upon the unsatisfactory nature of the household life. Then I went forth from the home life into homelessness. Then having gone forth, I took up the the precepts and the way of livelihood, the way of training of a bhikkhu, and then we have all of the intermediate stages of training here, which you'll find in Sutta 51. We don't have to go through them again. Up to the stage of purifying the mind of the five hindrances. And then he continues that having thus abandoned these 5 hindrances, the defilements of the mind that weaken wisdom, then secluded from sense pleasures, secluded from unwholesome mental states, I entered and dwelt in the first jhana. Then in sequence I entered the second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. But then there's a little difference from the standard sequence that we find elsewhere in the Majjhima Nikāya. Here he says directly, when my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, and so on, I directed it to knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. Now, where we find the sequence elsewhere in the Majjhima Nikāya, then we have what are called the te vijja, that is the 3 higher knowledges. That is the passage on using the concentrated mind to arouse knowledge or understanding begins with the recollection of previous lives. For example, we find this in Sutta number 27. Well, we find it in the Buddha's description of his own development in Majjhima Nikāya Sutta number 4. Then we find it in the description of the disciples' progress, Sutta number 27, Sutta number 39, Sutta number 51, also I think in Sutta number 73, perhaps some other suttas. But here, then from the recollection of past lives, then we come to the arising of the divine eye, which is the ability to directly perceive the passing away and rebirth of other beings, and to see how beings move from life to life in accordance with their karma. Then in the third place comes the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. But in this sutta, the exposition moves directly into the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. Then the commentary explains that those first 2 types of knowledge, recollection of past lives and the divine eye, are omitted here because the monk is trying to answer the question how he knows that his mind is liberated from the asavas, from the taints. And then the knowledge of past lives and the divine eye are not really essential for acquiring that knowledge. And so the speaker can move directly into the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. And so then he says, I directly knew as it actually is. This is suffering, this is its origin, its cessation. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. These are the asavas. This is the origin of the asavas. This is the cessation of the asavas. This is the way leading to the cessation of the asavas. When I knew and saw thus, my mind was liberated from the asava of sensual desire. Then it was liberated from the asava of craving for continued existence. And it was liberated from the asava of ignorance. And when it was liberated, then there came the knowledge that the mind is liberated, and I directly knew birth is destroyed. Birth is finished. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. there is no more coming back to any state of being. And so then he says that it is by knowing thus, by seeing thus, friends, that in regard to this body, with its consciousness and all external signs, I-making, mind-making, and the underlying tendency to conceit have been eradicated in me. Okay, now, first, any question on this part that I've just covered? Okay, now comes a little interesting observation. First, look at the title of the sutta. The title is the Sixfold Purity, right? So that means that there should be 6 ways in which the monk declares final knowledge. But let's see how many we've covered. Okay, we've had the section on the seen, heard, sensed, and cognized. Okay, then that covers sections 3 and 4. Then we have the section on the 5 aggregates. That's section 5 and 6. So we have 2. Then we have the section on the 6 elements. That is section 7 and 8. So we have 3. Then we have the section on the 6 internal and external bases. This is paragraphs 9 and 10, so we have 4. Then we have the section on how one knows that I-making, mind-making, and underlying tendency to conceit have been eradicated. That comprises sections 11 up through 20. So we have 5 methods actually, of 5 declarations, but it's called a sixfold cleansing, which suggests that something has been lost in the sutta. And then if we turn to the note here, note 1063, this is on page 1322, it says MA, that means the commentary, the Majjhima Atthakatha, the commentary to the Majjhima Nikāya, finds it difficult to account for the sixfold mentioned in the original title, since only 5 questions and answers have come down in the discourse. It suggests dividing the last item into 2, that is, one's own body with consciousness as one part, and then it says the conscious bodies of others as another part. But nothing like that is mentioned in the sutta itself. And then it also mentions another opinion which says that the 4 nutriments should be brought in as the 6th. In fact, I think if I remember, the commentary says that those across the ocean, or across the sea, say that the 4 nutriments should be brought in as the 6th. But I made these notes or prepared this edition, I think it was in 1988, something like that. So then I wrote, neither of these suggestions, however, appears cogent, and it seems likely that a part of the text has been lost. Okay, but then my friend and former student, Bhikkhu Analayo, had done a very detailed comparison of suttas from the Majjhima Nikaya with their counterparts preserved in other transmissions, including the Chinese Agama transmission. And I also checked on this myself, looking at he discovered, and I checked on this to validate it, in the Chinese version of the Majjhima Agama, or the Majjhima Agama preserved in Chinese translation, we have the sutta in which there are 6 sections, and the 6th section is in fact the section on the 4 nutriments. Actually, in the Majjhima Agama version, that section is the 2nd, not the 6th, but it fulfills 6 declarations. And so in the Majjhima Agama version, we have 6 sections in this way, in this Sikh order. First, the 5 aggregates. Then we have the section on the 4 nutriments. Then the section on the seen, heard, thought, and cognized. And then the section on the 6 internal sense bases, internal and external sense bases. Or I think this version just expresses it by way of the 6 internal sense bases. So that is the 4th. Then the 5th is in terms of the 6 elements. The 5th is in terms of the 6 elements. And then the 6th section is in terms of the sequential training to eliminate I-making, mind-making, and conceit. And this version says, in regard to the 4 nutriments, it uses the same phrasing, it seems, that is used in regard to the seen, heard, sensed, and cognized. That is, I dwell unattracted, unrepelled, independent, detached, free, dissociated, with a mind rid of barriers. And the 4 nutriments, just in case you're not familiar with this formulation, sometimes called the 4 foods or the 4 kinds of sustenance. One of them is, or the first, is material food. That is, what we ordinarily call food, the stuff that we eat. I'm speaking like a commentator. I've been reading the commentary to the Sutta Nipata, and where in the Sutta it uses the word mother, it says female parent, father, the male parent. Okay, so the first nutriment is material food. The second nutriment is contact, because contact is what nourishes feeling. And then the third nutriment is mental volition, because mental volition is what creates karma, and it's karma that nourishes the process of becoming. And then the 4th nutriment is vijnana, or consciousness, because consciousness is said to nourish or to sustain nama-rupa, that is the body and mind, the bodily and mental functions. Okay, so this will be our basic discussion of the sutta. So if anybody has any questions, please feel welcome to ask. Let me get my long distance. Anybody have a question? No questions? Okay.
It's just a comment, but I thought that
But it's better to take the microphone so it gets recorded.
perhaps by having the title Sixfold Purity, that the editor was trying to emphasize that was the sixfold, not just because it's more than 4 or 5, but that was the more thorough expression.
The more what?
Thorough.
Yeah.
More thorough, more complete expression of understanding, and that was not necessarily that there were 6, but that the one that had 6 elements to it was the one that was to be that had the highest standing among the others.
Yeah, I don't think I would agree with that. Because I think when it says Chabbisodhana, sixfold purity or sixfold cleansing, it is implying that there are 6 sections. Now since the version that's come down in the Majjhima Agama does have 6 sections, it seems that we should accept that has preserved the full text, and somehow that a section got lost in this transmission.
That is an internet question.
Okay.
So it is being asked, does I-making, mind-making, and conceit maps to not I am, not mine, not the self in other suttas?
Okay, that's a good question. The question is whether this negation of I-making, mind-making, and conceit maps to the formula, this is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. Yeah, the way the commentary is explained, that statement, not mine, not I, not myself, they connect not the contemplation, this is not mine, with the negation of craving. And so definitely that one correlates exactly with the negation of mind-making. Then this is not I, the commentary connects to the negation of conceit. And so that seems to link up with this one on the commentarial explanation. And then the contemplation, this is not myself. Of course, the commentary, quite evidently links up with the negation of the view of self. But it seems here that maybe the correspondence is not so exact, because it seems to me that I-making can comprise both the view of self and conceit. And so it seems almost as though conceit here duplicates part of I-making. But maybe, as I said, my speculation that the Buddha mentioned it separately because, it functions very prominently within people's mental lives. That's just my take on it. So you would say that more or less there's a correspondence, but one shouldn't be too sort of rigid and particular about trying to map out a correspondence.
So that's a question on my own. So when one sees the 5 aggregates and the mind starts to understand this concept of perhaps not I, not mine, not myself, does that happen for all 5 at one time? Or does it happen like the form aggregate first and then goes to the feeling and so on and so forth, and finally one day perhaps even the consciousness aggregate?
Certainly in the regular course of training, one goes through them individually. And then when one gets the ability through the sharpening of mindfulness and the capacity for observation, then one is able to call up sort of mentally each aggregate separately. So just adverting to the body, material form, and then one observes this, not mine, not I, not myself. Then one brings up the feeling and starts observing the feelings, pleasant feelings, painful feelings arising and passing away. And then one applies to them the contemplation, not mine, not I, not myself. Then one brings up the perception by noting how, the noting itself is perceptual activity, but one brings up this flow, the sequence of perceptions, and then observes that these perceptions, not mine, not I, not myself. Then one brings up the volition. In this case it would be the volition or the will to observe and contemplate, and then one reflects upon that willing or volitional activity as being not mine, not I, not myself. And then one turns to the subtlest of the five is the consciousness aggregate, and observes that even that awareness of what's taking place is arising and passing away, it's impermanent, so it's not mine, not I, not myself. Perhaps in more advanced stages one could bring all five together at once, but certainly to prepare the groundwork for that one has to go through individually. Any further questions? Okay, then we'll end for the day. And we won't have a discussion period this afternoon, because actually I want to join, there's a retreat going on in the Kuan Yin Hall, so I want to join that in the afternoon. And we won't have the class next week, because the retreat will still be in its last day, next Saturday. So the next class will be on, today is the 12th, 19th, 26th, April 26th. And that day we will be taking the Sappurisa Sutta, number 113. So it's a rather short sutta. Maybe we'll skip over it. You could read this. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We'll take number 114 next time. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. I think we don't have the forms with the formula. They're up the hill. But if you know it, then you can just recite along. And this is to share the merits with the deities, the bhutas or fear spirits, the nagas or dragon spirits, and with all beings in the world, wishing them to be well and happy, and wishing the devas to protect the Buddha's teachings. Akasata Chabbumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Sasanang Akasata Chabbumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabbumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mankarang Etavatacham Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavatacham Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavatacham Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadaya Avicihetato Etantare Satakayupapana Rupe Arupicha asanya sanino, dukkha pamuchantu, pusantu nibbutting. Okay, we can stand and we end with 3 bows to the Buddha. So I will get the chime. Oh.
I do want to bring back to the behavior for a couple of minutes.
Okay.
I'll do that later.